Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. In our last lecture, we had a look at the literary stylistics, how it looks at various elements like symbols, imagery, metaphors, personifications, which help us in understanding the meaning of the texts, which the writers have deliberately conveyed to us through metaphoric or symbolic gestures. Now, in these texts, which are literary texts, there are particular functions that the language of literary writings perform. The function of the stylistician is to identify, classify, and then comment upon these elements which are adding to the meaning of the text. And when we claim that we are learning the features or the methods that stylistics uses for the literary analysis of texts, we must understand that how the literary language is different from ordinary language. In our understanding of the literary language, its differences and its value, we try to look at what are the basic features that dominate in a literary writing, and especially poetry. The analysis of poetry is what most of the formalists and even literary critics and now also stylisticians focus on, because the language of poetry offers more broader a scope for a critic to observe the work, form the judgments, and then interpret how the style of language aids in conveying the meanings and how is it related to the functions that the various elements in a text perform. In today's lecture, we look at how the language of poetry distinguishes itself from the ordinary language. What are the features that are used by a writer to compose a poem so that he can convey the feeling of reality, dream, or a sensation of any thing that he has observed. Now, in order to make the writing appear authentic, true, and realistic, there are many elements that the writers focus on, and these elements work as a major component of the literary writing, that is the writing of poetry. Today we will have a look at certain literary concepts that dominate in stylistics or that are relevant for a stylistician to observe in the analysis of poems and literary texts. These features are the obvious ingredients of any writing, and today we will look at these ingredients with specific reference to poetry. As in the previous two lectures, we have looked at the literary stylistics, differentiating it from the linguistic stylistics. That literary stylistics focuses on the literary features. These literary features are the foregrounded realities, and these literary features are the deviations or the disruption of the normal pattern of speech and writing. The first of such features which the literary stylisticians focus on and the stylistics takes into account as its mode or method is to pick up those individual curiosities or the individual foregrounded features within the text. And one of such features is a symbol. A symbol is an object which stands for something that is something that exists outside the text. A symbol stands for something else. It may be something which may be a reference to something that exists in the political, moral, or religious terms. For example, we see that the dove is a symbol of peace, and white color is the symbol of purity. Snake is the symbol of deceit. Now, these images and things stand for something larger or something broader than what they literally are. For example, a simple bird, dove, may not be recognized as just a species of the bird. Rather, in literary writings, a symbol of dove may be employed to refer to the innocence and the simplicity which the bird symbolizes. It may even refer to peace. That is the usual way we look at the image of a bird. In a poem or a story, it is a word which, while signifying something specific, may also signify something that exists beyond itself. So symbols are those technical features in a literary writing, or more specifically in a poem, that function to make us look at a thing in more broader perspective. A writer may use the symbol of maybe a caged bird. Now, a caged bird symbolizes imprisonment. That might be a reference which the writer wants the reader to reach at in a very implicit way, in order to reveal the political subjugation of the people of a country, or the sort of oppression, that is the denial of the rights or even freedom of speech. So a caged bird in this case would become a symbol of imprisonment, injustice and tyranny, that is suppressed life of a victim or an individual who deserves liberty or freedom. So this is how the symbols would mean something else. In a poem, the writer might be talking about a caged bird that does not sing now because it is away from the beauty of the forest, or away from the rest of the birds. It cannot see the light, it cannot see the spring. Now, this reference might not be literally to the bird who is caged, because here the caged bird would symbolize something more greater and serious than what the bird in itself connotes. Now, the symbolic meanings of the caged bird makes us relate this symbol to freedom, which is the right of every individual. It might be the idea of the oppression and tyranny and injustice inflicted upon the common people, or the people of a particular country from whose side the poet seems to be speaking. So that is how the symbols operate within a writing or a poem. Now, it is important to understand what's the difference between image and symbol, because mostly students begin to take the idea of symbol and image as in a way that they mean the same. An image is associated with what might be stated within the poem. So what an image is associated with is usually found within the poem. For example, we look at the image of for example, scattered things, or the rotten things, maybe the imagery of decay. Now, these images are what reveal the chaos that exists in the life of the characters. If the characters inhabit a world or a place where you observe that everything is in disorder, clutter, chaos, or rotten things are abounding in the surroundings, these images of clutter, chaos, and disintegration reveal that the life of the characters within the story or a poem are disorganized, or are in a state of chaos. That chaos might be there in their personal lives, in their morals, or even in their social or political scene as well. Now, what the image here refers to lies within the text, whereas symbol might refer to something else, the way we looked at the caged bird, that within the poem, the poet is implicitly and in a hidden manner revealing to us that how the freedom of speech is denied. Now, in that way, the symbol exists outside the text, whereas the image is within the text. And with the symbols, or the use of symbols by the writers, we have to infer or interpret the meaning of those associations which the writer has made. For example, observe the same symbol of a caged bird, that the inferences we draw out of the caged bird are that the caged bird might be the poet himself, if he is talking with a viewpoint or a stance that might be labeled as a propaganda, or that might be curtailed or curbed as a desire of the poet, because he is creating the opposition for the government or the people whom he is speaking against. So in this way, the symbol makes associations, and it is up to the reader, or it is up to the stylistician or the analyst to infer the meanings and draw the associations that the symbols draw for the sake of multiplying and adding to the meaning of the poem. As we now understand the difference between image and symbol, that images are the objects which are there in the poem, whereas symbols are the objects which the writer wants to hint at. For example, observe the symbol of the dome-shaped whited sepulchre in the novel by Conrad, Heart of Darkness. In the Heart of Darkness, Joseph Conrad has employed the symbol of a place that is the office of the imperialist missionary that operates in Africa. Now, the symbol of the whited sepulchre or the dome-shaped building stands for something that exists outside the text as well, on moral and religious grounds as well. For example, the sepulchre or the dome-shaped building symbolizes the place where the Jews bury the dead. Now it begins to give, this symbol gives the reference to the dead bodies or the grave. Now the office symbolizes the graves of those materialistic people who are pursuing their desires, lust and greed in Africa for the sake of collecting ivory or wealth. So this is how a symbol would operate, that it would mean something else outside the text, outside the immediate situation of the poem or a writing. For example, a poet compares his or her love with a rose. For example, if a poet says that his love is a red rose, here the poet is using a figurative image and is associating the lover with something that is different from something that the person belongs to. So he is taking something from a different realm of experience. The lover is not a plant or not a vegetation, the way the symbol says that it is a rose. But here this particular image of rose connotes the facts that the lover is beautiful, that it reveals, the red rose reveals the passion and the intensity of love and emotions which make the poet see the lover in this light. So this image of a rose brings to our mind the associations that love or the lover would have with the rose. Its beauty, as the red rose is the most beautiful flower, intense in color, and also it has got fragrance. And when we look at the negative connotations too, we also find out that a rose, its life is quite transient, temporary. It may not last forever. It may not be as fresh as it is today forever. And also the fragrance may also fade away. It may wither out. And the rose also contains thorns with it. Now these associations make us understand why the writer has employed the image of rose for reference to the lover. So if the images of a rose, we bring the association of the positive traits associated with the rose and the negative traits associated with the rose. Among the positive traits, we can notice the fragrance, the red color, the beauty and its appreciation. But in the negative connotations, we observe how the same rose has got certain qualities which make it difficult for us to have it. For example, the thorns, and then its temporary life, as would be a reference to the fact that the poet is scared that love is something that he would have to pay the price of before getting it, and also that the love would be not everlasting. He is scared of the fact that the love may also fade away, like the fragrance and beauty of the red rose. And red rose is a cherished possession. Everyone would be after the red rose. So in this way, looking at these associations which the images in a poem make, we are able to see how much depth of meaning is carried within the images. Same is the case with symbols. If images draw our attention to the meanings that lie within the understanding of an image, it might be due to the associations and interpretations that we draw out of an image. Symbols are usually used when a writer wants to express something about that is maybe apprehension or his concern. It may be something that he cannot directly refer to due to certain restrictions, either political, moral or religious. So that is why symbols work to create a feeling that the writer has implicitly hinted at those ideas which the society may not let them speak about openly. It might bring about kind of criticism from the authorities, or maybe the society and the people, either political circles or religious circles. So that is why a poet would use symbols. Then a direct description wouldn't sound poetic enough. It would sound more like a description that is usually given for the sake of communication. So when poetry is composed, the writers do not want to reveal what they are talking about, who they are talking about, and why is it so. A writer's fall maybe in terms of his fall of maybe not being successful in his career as a poet would not be referred to as directly that he failed to make a name in the circles of poetry. That fall might be denoted with a kind of maybe sort of description that his feelings or his works are going unrewarded. Now this image of somebody not getting a reward of something from maybe a friend or a lover or maybe a sibling might be a reference to the fact that the world is not rewarding the poet of the contribution that he has made. So these are the ways a writer would express the ideas. Similarly, the idea of the cold-heartedness of the world might be referred to through the chill in the weather, or the things and surroundings getting covered in snow. Now the image of snow presents the harsh or the difficult circumstances in weather, but that might symbolically reveal the difficulties in the financial or the personal life of a poet. That would be his career maybe. So in this way you can see that how a symbol or an image would enable the poet to comment on those things which are so personal to them, and when they present them through symbols or images, these personal things become a bit covered up, and then it is not possible for the reader to decipher the very meaning. Rather, the associations that the readers draw are quite enough to supply the meanings and reveal the very nature of the sentiment that the poet has expressed. As far as the use of symbols is concerned, we find in poetry that poets start with an object, and then the object that has been taken from the real world will be loaded with meaning. That would be a symbolic meaning which is not explicitly stated. Imagine Keats's Ode to a Nightingale. In Ode to a Nightingale, he has presented the nightingale as a kind of symbol of eternity, beauty, joy, splendor, and a heavenly state of life. The nightingale in Keats's ode has been there in the ancient times and is able to sing now as well, and would be singing when the poet would be no more. Now this idea that the symbolic significance of Keats's nightingale has increased with the fact that the bird has been free to sing in the ancient times and also would be free to sing even when the poet would be no more, reveals the very fact that it is a symbol of eternity. So how a simple object, a bird, has been invested with meaning, that is the symbolic meaning. So you can see that Keats's nightingale becomes the symbol of eternity, and it is something that he sees in the bird's song and feels in the bird's movement and freedom, that he invests it with tantalizing significance. Now this significance is beyond the bird. If you observe the bird without looking at it symbolically, you would not believe the bird to be that significant, because the bird, like a human being too, is temporal and is mortal. But when Keats states that the bird speaks something that comes from the heaven, or is an eternal voice that has been heard in the past and that will be heard in the future, but the poet cannot really be eternal or enter into the realm or paradise where the bird has entered. Now, these symbolic associations that we make with the bird make the bird a symbol that stands for something else than its literal existence. Now, symbols become an aid in understanding the meaning of the poem, because a writer invests a symbol with plenty of meaning and with multiple meanings, which the readers draw on the basis of the evidence, and they make inferences out of the text and the work. One thing that is a tricky part of the use of symbols in the poems or literary writing is that symbolism can lose touch with the reality. When a poem becomes symbolic, it might lose a touch with reality, just the way it happens in the example that we studied, that Keats's poem Ode to a Nightingale would not give meaning or would not be effective for its interpretation if the bird is took in a literal meaning, the presence or the existence that has been granted to the image of a bird. But when the image of a bird is looked at symbolically, only then we find out the meanings of escapism, of the transience of life, and of the yearning and longing for a beautiful life like that of paradise. So in this way we can see that if symbols are difficult and tricky to interpret, at the same time they also make the poem enter into the unrealistic or more fantastic a world where these operate for the sake of enhancing the impact of the poem as well as the impact of the image. For the sake of understanding of symbolism, observe another example that is from William Blake's poem. In this poem, Blake makes use of the symbol of a red rose. Now, look how strange, unusual the use of red rose is. O rose, thou art sick. The invisible worm that flies in the night, in the howling storm, has found out thy bed of crimson joy, and his dark secret love does thy life destroy. This example by William Blake tells us that rose stands for something else than the very flower, because he's addressing the rose, calling that rose is getting sick, and some invisible insect is destroying its beauty, is quietly eating it up, and it's being destroyed. Now, if you look at the poem literally, you would feel that the poet is talking about something that relates to the idea of the gardener's life, that he would be concerned with the fact that how the plant or the rose is decaying, that some worm is eating it. Now, that does not really justify the purpose that a poet would compose a poem. The poet is not conveying these things to a gardener who should be taking care of the rose because it is being eaten up by a worm. Here the rose symbolizes something else, something that does not exist within the poem but there in the imagination of the poet, to which the reader and the analyst has to reach to. Here the rose becomes the symbol of the beloved, who the poet feels is being destroyed by an enemy or a foe. So the poem gives the image of something evil destroying something beautiful. Now the beautiful thing is the rose, that stands for the beloved, and the evil thing is the worm, that stands for the enemy or the foe. And looking at it metaphorically, as its interpretation is concerned, we find that it talks about the corruption or the corrupt passion that is destroying the beauty and innocence of the relationship of love. So in this way, see how a symbol stands for something that is larger than the image itself, that lies outside the very context of the poem, and that makes us understand that how poetry enhances our understanding that things may not be meaningful only if they are taken in their literal meanings. So if we go beyond the literal meaning of these words and understand the interpretation of the symbolic meanings of the poem and the image of the rose, only then we understand what the poet is talking about, something that he cannot directly talk about. And if he can talk about it directly, still we find that it won't be a literary expression. Now it becomes literary expression when it has become very ambiguous, that how artfully the poet has camouflaged the presence of the lover or his own feelings. And then with the symbol of a rose, he has described how the rose being destroyed by the worm is the symbol of his love or his beloved being destroyed or ruined or corrupted by some enemy or a foe. So this is how the symbols operate in work, and this is the job of a stylistician, to observe that what symbols have been employed, what do they mean literally, what do they connote, what do they refer to. So in terms of its interpretation, we rely on the interpretation of symbols for the sake of the fact that they enhance our understanding of the poems and they develop our appreciation about the poems as well. Apart from symbols and images, which the poets use in works like composition of the poems, which pack the poems with plenty of meaning and make it difficult for the reader to guess what the things they are talking about, because the reference is not direct but an indirect reference which needs to be inferred through the understanding of the connotations. There are other elements too that are literary elements employed by the poets in their poems, which create the poetry as a form or a work that operates differently than prose or ordinary speech and writing. Another important feature that we observe in poetry while we analyze it from the point of view of a stylistician or a literary stylistician is called rhythm. Rhythm is a very important ingredient in poetry, because you observe that when we listen to songs and poems, we remember them for a longer time as compared to reading lines or quotations from prose. We may remember the gist or the summary of a novel or a story, but hardly do we remember the lines until or unless we memorize them. But poetry without much effort becomes very easy to be remembered. And one of the reasons of the memorability is that it carries rhythm. And rhythm is created with the use of words which are balanced, which rhyme due to their maybe alliterative pattern or consonants and assonance. Rhythm means the flow and the movement of lines, and in poetry the writers deliberately take pains and plenty of care to create rhythm in the poem, whether it goes fast or slow, or it could be calm or troubled too. So rhythm of a poem may appear like maybe something that is smooth, that is like very flowing, just the way it is in lyrics and songs, that they appear smooth, lyrical, and have a certain flow because of the words which might correspond in the form of rhyme. Similarly, the rhythm can also be something that might break, appear disjointed, like a sort of staccato beat, which is more like jumps, or it is disjointed too. So the rhythm can be of these two extremes. Either it might be too flowy, rhythmic and calm, or it may be troubled or show breaks in the utterances or in the rhythm. Rhythm and meaning cannot be separated. So it is important to understand that rhythm is not the surface beauty of a poem. It's not something that operates at the level of the structure or the surface of the poem. It's not a device which is only employed for the sake of making the poem or a song or a lyric memorable. Rather, for a stylistician, this point is very important, that rhythm and meaning cannot be separated. You can observe many instances of poems and songs where you feel that there is correspondence between the rhythm of the poem and the meaning of the poem. Observe the example of the modern poetry in general. Modern poetry is, that is the poetry after the 20th century, and after the Second World War, like the poetry of Eliot, Ezra Pound, or W.B. Yeats, or poets like Philip Larkin, and also the modern poets in the form of E.E. Cummings. These poets' poems appear to be making a sort of experiment with the rhythm of the poems. Why? Because the themes of these poems have become quite serious, and they relate to the chaos, disintegration, and the idea of peace being disturbed in the world. So if the poetry composed by the poets after the Second World War is about the themes of destruction, themes of man losing control on his life that is due to his preoccupation with destroying things that lie there in the form of opposition, or the idea that the morals of the world have gone awry. It is aided with the disjointed rhythm in the poem. Observe Eliot's poems that also make use of the aid of the breaking of the rhythm, which relates to the fact that the lack of rhythm in the poem reveals the fact that there is something lacking in the modern man's life. The rhythm is disturbed, so the protagonist or the persona's life is what it corresponds with, which is lacking in action, which is lacking in harmony, and who is suffering with inertia, or who is suffering with sort of inertia, and is also revealing the picture of the disjointed, disorganized human being. So in this way we see that rhythm and meaning correspond. If a poet is making use of flow and rhyme and rhythm in the poem, he wants to convey a sense of order, symmetry. And if he is making use of the rhythm that is disjointed and disturbed, he is trying to convey the sense of something is wrong in the state of affairs of the life of the persons that he's talking about. So observe this example. Thus I, faltering forward, leaves around me falling, wind oozing thin through the thorn for norward, and the woman calling. In this example, that is from Thomas Hardy's poem, you can see that there is alliteration of the word on the words faltering, forward, falling, and there is a certain break. Thus I, faltering forward, leaves around me falling, wind oozing thin through the thorn. Now thin through the thorn for onward, and the woman calling. So the images like cold, or images like the wind, and also leaves falling, and wind oozing in the form of the chill of the winter that is penetrating through the body of the persona. Now all these things in the rhythm that are created to aid to the idea of cold and chill and isolation, loneliness, and also the mood of despair. So this is how rhythm in a poem also relates to the mood, the feeling the poet wants to convey to the reader, because he can do that only through the use of suitable words. And here the suitable words create a feeling of, or sensation of cold and isolated man, and that he has found himself in despair, as if he has been abandoned, as if he is lonely, and the chill and cold is not due to the winds only or the harsh weather, but it is due to loneliness and despair. So that mood of the poem corresponds with the rhythm that is faltering and falling. These words and sounds convey the same sense, as if the poet is falling apart, or the persona is breaking due to the chill, due to the cold, despair, and being abandoned and leading a solitary life. So this is how these images within the poem correspond with the rhythm and add to the meaning of the poem. So in this way, poets employ rhythm in the poem to correspond it and to aid the meaning and the theme of the poem. Observe another example. For example, the last example that we looked at was from the point of view of despair, loneliness, abandonment. This example would give you another idea about the rhythm. In John Donne's poem, The Sun Rising, he states, "Busy old fool, unruly sun, why does through windows and through curtains call on us?" Now, in this example, you see that Donne is directly addressing the sun and is a bit angry and even sort of, you can say, maybe it's revealing the frustration too for the sun's intervention into his life, because he wants to sleep. He doesn't want to wake up. So the sun has been referred to as busy. His regularity is condemned. Now, instead of praising the sun for rising regularly, unlike the poet, he is condemning it and calling it busy rather than disciplined, and then calling it a fool because he doesn't operate on his own whims and wishes and follows a routine. And in this way you can see that the way he calls it, busy old fool, unruly sun, the word unruly, fool, busy, and then the questioning tone and technique, why through windows and through curtains call on us. It's colloquial, it's ordinary language, it's not the language that is quite formal. So in the colloquial form, you see that the rhythm is chatty, it's like conversation, and the anger, the frustration is also evident. So it's lively, questioning manner or interrogative manner employed by the poet in order to sound a bit informal. So the informal way is aided by the rhythm of the poem, that is adding to the theme of the poem, that the poet is showing that he does not want to follow rules. If sun is something that obeys the rules and regulates the whole world through its comings and goings, the poet is least bothered about it. So in this chatty, colloquial and conversational, interrogative manner, the rhythm of the poem aids to the theme or the feeling of the poem, that is, the poet is not bound within the conventions of the society or the universe when it comes to the feeling of love or doing what he desires in life. So the rhythm in the poem is corresponding with the theme and the image that the poet wants to convey to the reader. Closely connected with the rhythm is rhyme, as the rhythm might be something that you find in every word, every sound in the poem and the overall composition of the poem, whereas rhyme is usually identified with either the end rhyme or the internal rhyme. Then there are many types of the rhyme as well. So rhyme is the identity of sounds, how sounds seem similar within a poem or within a line. If certain words have got the same sound, for example, the use of alliteration, the furrow followed free, the fair breeze blew, the white foam flew. Now in this example, see that the furrow followed free. In these words you can notice the repetition of the fur sound. Furrow followed free. This is rhyme that is created through the use of alliteration, the internal rhyme. Now the end rhyme is the fair breeze blew, the white foam flew. Now blew and flew in the end are rhyming together. So this is the end rhyme. So rhyme suggests harmony, order, balance, and it is usually employed either at the end of the word or in the running lines, which might be the internal rhyme as well. So the poet finds connections between words if only at the level of sound, but the connection made suggests something broader. The idea may be finding order in things, finding order in life, or conveying the sense of calmness, or the organization, the idea of flow, similarity, beauty. These are the ways the poets would employ rhyme, not only to add to memorability, but also to convey a sense of order, peace, and calmness within the poem or within the context of the poem. For the sake of observing the rhyme and rhythm, that concept of rhyme and rhythm, that is the most significant one as far as the conventional and romantic poetry or classical poetry is concerned. Though in the modern poems we see there are violations about rhyme and rhythm as well. But if they break the rhyme and rhythm in terms of the end rhyme, the poets in the modern times use internal rhyme still in their poems. Observe this example, that is by Wordsworth. The poem is Solitary Reaper. Observe that the writer has made use of certain words which rhyme together. Not only they create internal rhyme, but add to the rhythm, that is the overall pattern of the poem. Behold her single in the field, yon solitary highland lass, reaping and singing by herself, stop here or gently pass. Alone she cuts and binds the grain, and sings a melancholy strain. Oh, listen, for the vale profound is overflowing with the sound. Now the words lass and pass, grain and strain, profound and sound are rhyming together. Now this end rhyme on lass, pass, grain, strain, profound, sound adds the rhythm. And as the poet in the poem is saying that the song of the girl is rhythmic, it's beautiful. He doesn't narrate the song, that what the girl in the fields is singing, but the harmony, the flow, that the feeling of listening to a song evokes in a reader's mind or in the poet's mind is captured by the use of rhyme and rhyme in the poem. So the same flow that the song has got, the same flow that the poet has tried to capture through words is done by the poet in the form of the rhythm and rhyme that he creates within the poem. So the flow of the song, that is the theme of the poem, because in the poem the poet is praising the beauty, the harmony of the song, how pure, how natural, and how unrestrained the expression of the girl was. Now the girl who was singing in the field is not seen by us. Neither the song of the girl which she was singing when the poet encountered her is described. What is described is that the song was rhythmic. She was singing gently. She was busy in work as well as in singing, and she was singing a melancholy song, and the whole valley was overflowing or was filled with the beautiful song of the girl. And in order to relate to what a rhythmic and beautiful and melancholy song it would be, the writer has made use of the rhyme in the form of the end rhyme. Then certain words like sings and strain create internal rhyme. In the third last line you can see that the word sings and strain, they rhyme together, that is internal rhyme. Then look at these words like highland lass. Now Highland lass also has a kind of flow. It does not get stuck when we speak it. And look at the expressions like use of the ing form, singing, reaping. Now the word singing, reaping, and then in the last line the word overflowing. The ing form makes the idea more continuous, more like something going on, activities going on right now as well. And it is adding to the fact that the writer or the poet feels that since the memory is alive, the action is also going on, still going on in his mind. So the ing form or the gerund form adds to the continuity and the flow, which is aided with the end rhyme as well, internal rhyme as well, and the use of the ing form or the present continuous tense on various occasions in this stanza. So this is how, if we observe minutely, we would find rhythm and rhyme operating to perform various functions in a poem. So now it is clear that rhythm and rhyme is not just the external beauty of a poem that is done for the sake of making the poem memorable or making the words balanced so that they can be remembered and they're not forgotten. Look how through our observation of these examples has made us understand that rhyme too has something to do with the meanings of the poems. If the rhyme is breaking, it is stuttering, it is coming across hurdles and blockages, it reveals the disjointed and disintegrated life of the characters, the feelings of or the thoughts of the persona. If it is flowing like the way it is in The Solitary Reaper, it reveals how much peace, how much calmness does the poet derive from the moment of experience that he is describing to the reader. The beauty, the flow, the continuity of the memory and the remembrance has brought the same at the level of the structure of the poem, and that structural device of rhythm and rhyme is connected to the theme, the meaning of the poem, the message of the poem. Similarly, observe the idea of rhyme that is closely connected to the rhythm. We can say that rhyme is linked as it can be something that can link the problematic words as well. Now, rhyme cannot be only looked at one way that we looked earlier at, that rhyme is making certain similar things correspond. Rhyme can also bring closer to disparate things, to opposite things. For example, observe how rhyme can bring antithetical, unusual and disparate opposites together. That is the example from Andrew Marvell, that is he is a metaphysical poet, and the poem that I have chosen to take the example from is his Coy Mistress. In his Coy Mistress, Marvell states that had we but whirled enough in time, this coyness lady were no crime. Now observe this couplet that in this line he has used the word time and then it is rhyming with the second line's last word, crime. Observe the meaning of these two words, time and crime. They reveal a sort of a problematic state, that they are troublesome ideas, but here they are absorbed into a couplet. And rhyme has this ability to unify, to connect or bring closer two disparate or opposite entities like time and crime. Finding similarity in dissimilarities is what is the job of the stylistician. We see that the problem of time and crime highlighted by the poet deserves significance. Though they are rhyming together, as time and crime sound the same because of the end rhyme, but they do not really mean the same as far as their meaning is concerned. How we see that the use of rhyme contributes to the overall meaning and effect of the poem. That is, crime is something that is negative, time is something that is the present, the age, the world. Now, crime doesn't correspond with time in terms of meaning, but only in terms of structure as far as the rhyme is concerned. So if he's saying to the beloved in the poem that the time is running out, the world would fade away as they would be dead soon, then the coyness or shyness would be a crime. So if the lady or the beloved is not willing to submit to the wishes of the lover, then the time, that is the world that is at their disposal, wouldn't be enough for them, because he's persuading her that it's a crime not to give way to the feelings and emotions which the beloved wants her to express. So in this way, time reflects life, time reflects what is at hand, time reflects the age, and crime reveals something negative, that is a violation, that may be something that is punishable. But how the poet has brought these two opposites together in order to convince us for the argument, or the persona in the poem is convincing the beloved and making an argument, that argument becomes more appalling and significant when the two opposites are linked through the use of rhyme. So see how rhyme may not be only bringing two similar things together, the way it was there in the last poem, singing and reaping. Now those things were again looked at from the perspective, one is activity that is of kind of a laborious activity, and the other is an activity that is of recreation. So singing becomes recreational, and reaping, as cutting the grain symbolizes it, is something that becomes work, or that becomes a physical labor. So this is how rhyme and rhythm are both connected to the meanings, and how minutely we as the learners and students of stylistics are supposed to observe the rhyme, the rhythm, pattern, and the structure of the poem. Another important feature that we must take into account when we look at a poem from the point of view of a stylistician, or from the literary point of view, is the issue of locating the speaker or the persona and the audience of a poem. So when you come across a poem, one thing that you ask yourself is that who is speaking in the poem? Who is addressing us? Or who is it that he is addressing to? Now, these are the problems that you might also be coming across in the novels and the stories too, because in the novels and stories it is pretty easier to locate the characters and who are those that they are talking to or addressing to. But in a poem it becomes difficult, because poems are a bit ambiguous, they are a bit short as well in length, so they do not allow the writer a room to develop a character within the poem. So a poem is usually associated with the poet, as it is the expression of the poet's feeling, so we say that the poet is saying so. But a number of times in poems, it might not be the poet who directly locates himself within the poem. The poet might create a character that is called a persona, who speaks on behalf of the poet. That is the imaginary character that the poet might have created for the sake of conveying the sense or the meaning in the poem. So unlike a story or a novel, the problem of locating the persona or even the audience in the poem becomes a bit troublesome for the reader, and usually for the literary statisticians and the readers too. So look at these examples. These examples would help you understand what is the difference between the speaker and the persona and the poet. Firstly, look at the fact that the poem might be written from the perspective of the poet himself. Within the poem, the poet might be directly addressing the audience, that is the reader. Now, audience can be the reader, that is something that exists outside the text. But within the poem, there might be some other audience too, maybe poet addressing to a friend, a poet addressing to a particular society or a group of people, poet addressing within the poem to a beloved maybe. So the audience within the poem in the immediate context might be a specific person, and then the implied audience that exists outside the text is the reader. This example states that a poet might be talking himself directly through the poem, as is the case with maybe a poem like an ode. This is the example from Milton's ode on his blindness, where he states that, when I consider how my light is spent, are half my days in this dark world and wide lodged with me useless, though my soul more bent. Now, the words I consider how my light is spent, my days, and lodged me useless, my soul more bent, they reveal that the poet, as it is an ode, is talking directly. So where here we say that it is the poet's direct expression, his thoughts expressed directly to the reader, and the audience is the reader directly. So such a poem is simple to understand. In such a poem like this is an ode, it is simple to locate the persona or the poet. But in poems which are for example, dramatic monologues, it becomes a bit difficult, because the persona might not be the poet himself, though the poet is the composer of the poem, but within the poem he might have created some character that speaks as differently or narrates some experience which might not have been the experience of the poet himself, but an imaginary situation. So look at the dramatic monologue. An example is My Last Touches by Robert Browning. In it we see that it is not Browning, it's not persona that is speaking, rather it's a character. It is not the poet but an implied character. That is, that's my last Duchess, painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. I call that piece a wonder now. Fra Pandolf's hands worked busily a day, and there she stands. Here we see that this utterance in the poem is uttered by a character that has been designed, created by the poet. So we do not say that the poet or Robert Browning is telling us about his last Duchess. Here we say that Browning created a persona or a character within his dramatic monologue, My Last Duchess, in which this character is a duke or a king who is telling an implied listener, who is the ambassador of some other country, about the last Duchess that is now lying there in the form of a painting. It's the painting that is being observed. So look that difference. We observed the ode first, that was Milton's On His Blindness, where Milton directly is expressing his grief and his sorrow at the fact of losing the eyesight, that how would he serve God now. That was the poet himself speaking within the poem. But here in this example of a dramatic monologue by Robert Browning, you clearly see that Browning has created a character who is a king or a duke, and it's not the poet himself, it's not Browning himself, and he is talking to an implied listener who is the ambassador of another country about somebody that we do not meet in the poem but see only in the form of the portrait painted on the canvas. That is the way the poet to problematize the idea of speaker, persona and audience. Now the audience becomes the immediate person whom the Duke is addressing. In this poem, in the context of this poem, the Duke is the persona or the character speaking, and the ambassador from another country is the implied listener. But outside the context of the poem, the reader is also the implied listener. So this is how problematic this is, that not just characters would exist only in the stories and novels, characters are also found within the poem. That is why we need to locate the speaker, that who is talking, who is speaking within the poem or narrating the experiences, or who the poem is addressed to, who the persona or the speaker is talking to. So observe the last example by Donne. That was the poem, The Good Morrow, busy old fool, unruly sun, why dost thou through windows and through curtains call on us? There you can see that the persona was addressing the sun. There the audience was a kind of abstract thing, that is sun. So this is how you can locate the audience, the speaker, the persona within a poem. And not always would the poem be kind of utterance, that is the expression of a poet who is directly talking to the reader. So mostly the novice or the layman consider that the poem is always showing us the presence of a poet or the experience of a poet, just the way a dramatist or a novelist might not have gone through the experiences, all the experiences that he makes his characters go through. Similarly, a poet too might not have gone through the same experiences which he narrates in his poems through various characters or personas. They might be the thoughts, they might be the imagination, the reverie and the fantasy of the poet too. And then, like in the dramatic monologues, there might be imaginative situations and characters which the poets create. So, as a stylistician and as a literary stylistician or the student of stylistics, when you perform the literary analysis, give consideration to the thought of a speaker and the persona, and locate the audience that might lie within the poem and the persona that might be the poet himself or some character that is created by the poet. So speaker, persona and audience are one of the major elements that you locate when you are observing the style of poetry, when you are analyzing the composition of poetry. So it helps you in understanding the meanings of the poems and helps you understand that how the composition of a poem through the use of certain techniques like speaker, audience, persona makes the message appear more realistic, authentic and even attractive to the reader. Another important element that as the learners of stylistics and as the analysts of literature we are supposed to focus on is situation and setting. We are talking within the context of a poem. We are talking about the interpretation and analysis of poetry. So poetry also, or a poem also, exhibits a setting. It also takes place in a particular situation. So it's not just the novels or plays or short stories where the setting or the situation is important. Situation is the place or the location within a poem. It is where the action takes place. For example, observe the last example that was My Last Duchess by Robert Browning. There you can talk about the situation in this way, that the situation is a point or a time in the persona or the Duke's life when he is meeting a messenger from another country, and the place is the palace itself. Now the poem is taking place in a particular setting, that is the palace of the Duke, and he is showing the portraits of his family to the messenger. Now the setting is the palace and the situation is that he has got a proposal by the messenger, and the messenger has brought the proposal of and maybe the Duchess of their country or the princess of their country for the Duke. That is why he's telling him about his history or past, or showing off the lineage or the ancestors or the portraits of the house. Now you can see that we located the situation. Situation is the immediate context within which a character is placed. For example, the Duke in My Last Duchess is placed in a particular time when he is about to choose another wife. That is closer in our understanding due to the fact that he has been invited by the Duke, as the imagery is paying him a visit, and the location is the palace itself. Then it might be something imaginary too. For example, imaginary setting can be something abstract. For example, a poet imagining a moment of parting with a beloved, or maybe imagining his time of death, or imagining his life beyond death. Observe Emily Dickinson's poems where she talks about a fly buzz. She says in the poem that I heard a fly buzz when I died. Now in that poem by Dickinson, the setting is the implied setting or an abstract setting, that is a deathbed or a grave. Now she hasn't experienced it yet, or she is not revealing it after leaving the world. Rather, she is revealing it in imagination. Now the setting is that of a deathbed or a grave. That is sort of abstract an idea. The situation is not something that the persona might have experienced. So you can see that how setting can be real world, that is the concrete setting, like the palace of a king, the countryside, a particular room in which an action takes place, or it might be anything that is maybe the sort of description of heaven or hell. So the imaginary setting might be the situation or a moment that is not concrete or physical setting, but that exists in the mind, that exists in the imagination and fantasy of a poet. So in this way, look how setting can be located within a poem. It is the immediate place, concrete place where action takes place. It is also imaginary setting where the writer or the poet is imagining the things or himself to be existing. Closely related to the ideas of situation, setting, and also the tone and the rhythm of the poem are the ideas of mood and the tone of the poem. Mood and tone are connected to the expressions, the words, the language that the poets have employed. The feeling that a poem conveys is conveyed through the words, and those feelings might range from anything like a mood that might be happy, sad, exasperated, or it might be dejected or regretful too. Then comes the tone, which might be sarcastic, ironic, humorous, serious, melancholic. Now, there would be use of particular words which would imply or hint that the poem conveys sarcastic, ironic, humorous, or exasperated feelings of the poet or characters. Then the mood of the poem through the words can be judged or identified to be adding to the melancholy, sadness, gloom. For the understanding of mood and tone, we can say that the poem is optimistic, the poem is pessimistic. Now, these are the generalizations that you make on the basis of the evidence that you find in the text of the poem, depending upon the words being used. Observe the example that is taken from The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. Robert Frost's poem, I shall be telling this with a sigh. Somewhere ages and ages hence, two roads diverged in a wood, and I chose the one less travelled by. Now, the words like sigh and then reference to the passage of time with the repetition of the word ages and ages, then repetition of this phrase, and I. Again, the next slide begins with I took the one less travelled by. It reveals that the poet is in a feeling of maybe a pensive or a sad mood. The word sigh shows feeling of regret, loss, or the inability to go back to a point in life or time when he could have made some other choice. So it is the words like sigh and repetition of the word ages and then repetition of the word I, which reveals a sense of sadness, a feeling of regret, a feeling of melancholy, a feeling of dejection or inability, that is showing his incapacity as a human being not to be able to go back and change the things of the past. So this is how the words, the diction, the expressions convey the mood and make up the overall tone of the poem. The tone might be sarcastic, or it might be humorous, or it might be pessimistic, or it might be optimistic. It would range to multiple emotions and feelings of a human being, and that is possible only through the use of specific words, words which are emotive words. We discussed in the previous few lectures the significance of emotive language, that how a language conveys the emotions of a speaker and how it makes the reader to relate with the same emotions. Here in this example by Robert Frost, taken from The Road Not Taken, you can see that the power of these emotive words, that emotive words are conveying a mood and making up overall tone of the poem. That is carrying the feeling of sadness, gloom and regret. And that is how the tone or the mood of a poem express the fact that a poet, after all, has composed this poem in order to present to the reader the idea that how words are useful and effective in conveying those feelings which might only be there in the mind or in the heart. Now those emotions which are quite difficult to express also find their way through the very organized use of emotive language and then its organization into a rhythmic or a flowy verse, and then through repetitions and emotive words it may convey loss, regret, or even pain, sorrow, dejection, and even anger, frustration, or sort of feeling of you can say jealousy, or maybe it can be connected to the idea of satire and sarcasm. So it's the emotive words and language, expressive words and language that conveys the tone and mood of a poem. Observe this example by Dylan Thomas. In this example, Dylan Thomas states that, "Do not go gentle into that good night." And also in the third line makes use of the word rage and repeats it, rage, rage, against the dying of the light. Just the way we discussed earlier that a poem can also express anger. It can also express a feeling of exasperation, or you can say frustration. Here that is evident, that the poet says, "Do not go gentle into that good night." He is telling the reader or some implied listener not to accept death calmly, fight against it. Then the use of word rage or anger is tempting the reader or the implied persona to fight against death, to fight against giving up. So that example shows that how different set of words, diction, and emotive language can change the mood of the feeling of the poem. In the previous example, that was from Road Not Taken, the mood of dejection, inability, and sadness dominated. In this poem by Dylan Thomas, the mood of anger, frustration dominates, which is exhibited by the particular words like warning, do not go gentle into good night, and then rage, rage against the dying of the light. So this is how the emotive words, expressions accurately depict what the poet is feeling, and he may create or arouse the same feeling in the reader. When the reader reads it, he undergoes the same experiences. And as a stylistician, it is your job that like a stylistician, you are supposed to estimate, locate such words and expressions which are creating a particular mood or which are creating a particular tone of the poem. So in today's lecture, we looked at a few very important stylistic and figurative or literary notions and devices like symbol, image, tone, mood, speaker, situation, audience, or persona. Now these features are what we looked at from the perspective of the analysis of poetry. So in the coming few lectures also we will observe the ingredients of poems from the perspective of stylistician, and also we will also look at how prose operates using the same features and how are they different from the features that are studied for the sake of analysis of poetry. Thank you.